Beverly Hills, October 1973. The crystal ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel was glittering with the most prestigious gathering in Hollywood history, the inaugural American Film Institute Lifetime Achievement Awards ceremony. 200 of the industry's most powerful figures had assembled to celebrate cinematic excellence, dressed in their finest evening wear and radiating the kind of self-satisfied glamour that only comes with massive success and international recognition. Michael Caine sat at table 12, quietly enjoying the evening in the company of his fellow actors, completely unaware that he was about to become the target of one of the most vicious public attacks in Hollywood history. Because when Marlon Brando decided to use his acceptance speech to humiliate Michael in front of the entire entertainment establishment, he had no idea that Michael's calm, devastating response would not only destroy Brando's reputation, but force the greatest actor of his generation to literally fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. The American Film Institute had chosen this particular evening to honor the art of cinema and the craft of acting. The guest list represented the absolute pinnacle of Hollywood achievement, directors like Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas, producers like Robert Evans and Ray Stark, and actors whose names were synonymous with cinematic greatness. Elizabeth Taylor sat at the head table, radiant in diamonds and emerald silk. Paul Newman commanded attention with his effortless charisma. Jack Nicholson held court at a corner table, entertaining a group of writers and directors with his legendary wit. And at the center of it all, both literally and figuratively, was Marlon Brando. At 49, Brando was at the absolute height of his powers and influence. The Godfather had redefined what film acting could be, earning him universal acclaim and his second Academy Award. His method approach had revolutionized the craft, inspiring a generation of actors who worshipped him as the ultimate artist. He was more than just an actor. He was considered a genius, a revolutionary, the single most important figure in modern American cinema. But with that genius came arrogance, narcissism, and a cruel streak that manifested itself in his treatment of anyone he deemed inferior to his artistic standards. Brando had made a career of publicly humiliating actors, directors, and producers who didn't meet his exacting criteria for what constituted real art. Michael Caine represented everything that Brando despised about the film industry. Where Brando was a trained method actor who had studied at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, Michael was largely self-taught, having developed his craft through years of repertory theater and bit parts in British films. Where Brando chose his projects based on artistic merit and social significance, Michael had built his career on commercial entertainment, spy films, action movies, and romantic comedies that prioritized audience enjoyment over critical acclaim. To Brando's way of thinking, Michael Caine wasn't a real actor at all. He was a movie star, which in Brando's estimation was something entirely different and infinitely less worthy of respect. The two men had never worked together, but their paths had crossed several times at industry events and film festivals. Each encounter had been polite but tense, with Brando making subtle comments about commercial actors and pretty boys who read lines, while Michael maintained his characteristic diplomatic composure. But tonight was different. Tonight, Brando was being honored with the AFI's first-ever Lifetime Achievement Award, and the platform that came with that honor would give him the perfect opportunity to express his views about the state of American cinema and the actors who were, in his opinion, corrupting it. The evening had proceeded beautifully through dinner and the early awards presentations. Industry legends had been celebrated, touching speeches had been delivered, and the assembled guests were feeling the warm satisfaction that comes from being part of something historically significant. When AFI President George Stevens Jr. rose to introduce Brando, the anticipation in the room was palpable. Everyone understood they were about to hear from the most important actor of their generation, and expectations were high for insights into the craft, reflections on his career, and perhaps some wisdom about the future of cinema. "Ladies and gentlemen," Stevens announced, "it is my extraordinary privilege to present the first-ever AFI Lifetime Achievement Award to a man whose revolutionary approach to acting has transformed not just American cinema, but the very understanding of what it means to create truth on screen. Marlon Brando." The standing ovation was immediate and thunderous. 200 of the most successful people in entertainment rose to their feet, applauding the man who had redefined their art form. Brando walked to the podium with the measured pace of someone who knew he commanded absolute attention and respect. For the first 10 minutes, his speech was everything the audience had hoped for. thoughtful reflections on the craft of acting, insights into the collaborative nature of filmmaking, and appreciation for the artists who had influenced his own development. He spoke about the responsibility that came with the power to reach millions of people through cinema, and the importance of using that power to tell stories that mattered. But then his tone began to shift. However, Brando said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I must confess that I am deeply concerned about the direction our industry has taken in recent years." The audience settled back in their seats, sensing that they were about to hear something more controversial than the usual platitudes about artistic excellence. We are living in an era where commerce has begun to triumph over art, where box office receipts matter more than emotional truth, where actors have become brands rather than artists. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. This was starting to sound like a lecture rather than an acceptance speech. "I see actors today who have achieved enormous success and international recognition without ever bothering to understand the fundamental principles of their craft. They show up, they hit their marks, they deliver their lines with adequate competence, and they collect their paychecks. And the industry rewards them for this mediocrity because their films make money." The room was growing tense. Everyone understood that Brando was building towards something, but no one was quite sure what. "These actors," Brando continued, "are not artists. They are not craftsmen. They are entertainers at best, frauds at worst. They have taken the sacred art of performance and turned it into a commodity to be bought and sold." Michael felt a cold sensation building in his stomach. Something about Brando's tone and the direction of his comments suggested that this wasn't going to remain abstract much longer. "And perhaps the most egregious example of this corruption of our art form," Brando said, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Michael's table, "is sitting right here in this room tonight." The silence was absolute. Everyone in the ballroom understood that they were about to witness something unprecedented. "Michael Caine," Brando said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, "has built an entire career on being adequate. He is the very definition of a hack, someone who has mastered the surface elements of acting without ever bothering to understand its deeper significance." The audience was frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. This kind of direct personal attack was unheard of at such an event. "Michael reads his lines competently. He hits his marks reliably. He looks good on camera. And for this he has been rewarded with fame, fortune, and international recognition. But he has never, not once, delivered a performance that revealed any understanding of what acting actually is." Michael sat perfectly still, his face calm but his mind racing. Around him, his tablemates looked mortified. Some people in the audience were looking down at their plates, too embarrassed to watch this public humiliation unfold. "Michael Caine represents everything that is wrong with modern Hollywood," Brando continued, clearly enjoying the power of the moment and the complete attention of his audience. "He is the triumph of style over substance, of commerce over art, of superficial charm over genuine emotion." Brando paused for effect, savoring the tension in the room. "He is, in short, a hack. A very successful hack, but a hack nonetheless." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room was staring at Michael, waiting to see how he would respond to this unprecedented public attack. Michael stood up slowly, adjusting his dinner jacket with characteristic precision. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the ballroom's perfect acoustics. "Marlon," he said, his tone conversational, almost friendly, "that's a fascinating perspective on my career. I'd like to share a few thoughts about yours, if I may." Brando looked surprised. He'd expected anger, embarrassment, or stunned silence. He hadn't anticipated this calm, measured response. "Please," Brando said, gesturing magnanimously from the podium. "By all means." Michael began walking toward the stage, his pace unhurried but purposeful. As he moved, he spoke in that clear, precise voice that had made him one of the most recognizable actors in the world. "You've built your reputation on being a serious artist, someone who takes risks and explores the depths of human emotion, and you've achieved remarkable things with that approach. The Godfather, On the Waterfront, A Streetcar Named Desires, these are genuinely great performances." The audience was riveted. This wasn't the angry confrontation they'd expected. This was something else entirely. "But I think it's interesting that you've chosen tonight to lecture the room about artistic integrity and the corruption of our industry. because it raises some questions about your own recent choices. Michael had reached the stage now and was standing next to the podium where Brando waited, looking less confident than he had moments earlier. For instance, Michael continued, his voice still calm and conversational, "How do we reconcile your passionate defense of artistic purity with your decision to accept $12 million to appear in Superman?" The comment hit the room like a physical blow. Everyone knew about Brando's controversial casting in the upcoming Superman film, but no one had dared to criticize it publicly. $12 million, Michael repeated, for what amounts to a glorified cameo in a comic book movie. Now, I'm not criticizing the project. I think comic book movies can be entertaining and worthwhile. But I'm curious about how that decision fits with your philosophy about choosing art over commerce. Brando's face was reddening, but Michael wasn't finished. Or perhaps we could discuss your approach to preparation and professionalism. You've spoken eloquently tonight about the sacred art of performance, but I'm wondering how that squares with your habit of arriving on set unprepared and reading your lines off cue cards. The audience was stunned. No one talked about Brando's notorious unprofessionalism in public, but everyone in the industry knew about it. I've spoken to directors who've worked with you, Marlon. They tell fascinating stories about your methods, how you refuse to learn your lines, insisting that spontaneity is more important than preparation, how you show up hours late to set, keeping entire crews waiting while you decide whether you're in the mood to work. Michael's voice remained calm, but his words were devastating. Francis Ford Coppola told me about filming The Godfather, how you would disappear for hours during crucial scenes, leaving everyone waiting while you pursued whatever personal interest had captured your attention that day. The mention of Coppola sent another shock through the room. This wasn't just Michael's opinion, he was quoting one of the most respected directors in the industry. And I think my favorite story comes from the set of Mutiny on the Bounty. Do you remember that production, Marlon? The one where your unprofessionalism and ego caused such massive delays that the film went millions of dollars over budget. Brando tried to interrupt, but Michael continued speaking, his voice growing stronger. You fired the original director, Louis Milestone, because he had the audacity to expect you to show up on time and know your lines. Then you essentially took over the direction yourself, despite having no experience or training as a filmmaker. The audience was completely silent, riveted by this unprecedented confrontation. The result was a film that took 2 years to complete instead of 6 months, cost $30 million instead of $10 million, and was such a commercial and critical disaster that it nearly bankrupted MGM. Michael turned to face the audience, speaking directly to them now rather than to Brando. But here's what I find most interesting about tonight's lecture on artistic integrity. Marlon has spent the last 10 minutes criticizing actors who prioritize commercial success over artistic truth. But let's look at his actual track record. Michael's analysis was surgical in its precision. Since The Godfather in 1972, Marlon has appeared in exactly 3 films: Last Tango in Paris, which was banned in several countries for its explicit content; The Missouri Breaks, which was universally panned by critics; and now Superman, for which he's being paid more money than most actors see in their entire careers. The mathematical brutality of this assessment was devastating. So in 3 years we have 1 controversial art film, 1 commercial failure, and 1 massive payday for a comic book movie. This is the track record of someone who's lecturing the rest of us about artistic purity. Michael's voice grew quieter but somehow more powerful. You want to know the difference between us, Marlon? I've never pretended to be anything other than what I am. I'm a working actor who tries to choose good projects and give honest performances. I don't claim to be reinventing the art form or delivering profound truths about the human condition. Michael looked directly at Brando. But I do show up on time. I learn my lines. I treat my fellow actors and the crew with respect. And I deliver what I promise when I promise it. The room was absolutely silent. You, on the other hand, have built a career on promising profound artistic experiences and then delivering self-indulgent performances that serve your ego more than they serve the story. Michael's final statement was delivered with devastating calm. So before you lecture me about being a hack, perhaps you should consider what it means to be a professional, because in my experience, the greatest artists are also the most disciplined craftsmen, and discipline, Marlon, is something you abandoned years ago. What happened next shocked everyone in the room. Marlon Brando, the most celebrated actor of his generation, The man who had just finished lecturing the assembled crowd about artistic integrity slowly sank to his knees on the stage. "Michael," he said, his voice barely audible. "I apologize. You're right. About all of it." The sight of Brando on his knees, publicly acknowledging his failures, was something no one in that room would ever forget. "I've become everything I used to despise," Brando continued, tears visible in his eyes. "Lazy, self-indulgent, unprofessional. And instead of facing that truth, I decided to attack you for being everything I should be but am not." Michael stood quietly, allowing Brando to continue. "You're right that I don't show up prepared. You're right that I keep people waiting. You're right that I've chosen money over art more often than I care to admit." Brando looked up at Michael from his position on the floor. "And you're right that you've built your career on professionalism, reliability, and respect for the craft. I should have been praising you tonight, not attacking you." Michael reached down and offered his hand to help Brando stand. "Get up, Marlon," he said quietly. "This isn't necessary." But Brando remained on his knees. "It is necessary," he said, "because I need everyone in this room to know that what I said about you was wrong, cruel, and born out of my own frustration with what I've become." Finally, Brando accepted Michael's hand and stood up, but the damage to his reputation was done. The remainder of the evening proceeded in stunned silence. Brando finished his speech with a subdued apology for his behavior, and the ceremony concluded without any of the celebratory atmosphere that had marked its beginning. In the weeks that followed, the story of Michael's confrontation with Brando spread throughout Hollywood and beyond. Entertainment reporters called it the most dramatic public takedown in industry history. But more importantly, it fundamentally changed how people viewed both men. Michael's stock rose enormously. Industry professionals who had previously dismissed him as merely a charming movie star began to recognize his intelligence, professionalism, and understanding of the business. Directors started seeking him out for more complex, challenging roles. Brando, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. The public humiliation had exposed not just his professional failures but his personal insecurities and cruelty. Projects that had been offered to him were quietly withdrawn. His agents struggled to find directors willing to work with someone who had been so publicly revealed as unprofessional and unreliable. But perhaps most significantly, the incident forced the industry to confront uncomfortable truths about the difference between talent and professionalism, between artistic reputation and actual artistic achievement. Michael Caine showed us that night that real artistry isn't about grand gestures and public proclamations, wrote influential critic Pauline Kael. It's about consistently doing excellent work with intelligence, preparation, and respect for your collaborators. The confrontation also had a lasting impact on both men's subsequent careers. Michael went on to some of his finest work in the late 1970s and 1980s, including Academy Award-winning performances that proved his dramatic range and artistic depth. Brando, chastened by his public humiliation, attempted to rebuild his reputation through more disciplined work, but he never fully recovered from the exposure of his unprofessionalism and cruelty. Years later, when asked about the incident, Michael reflected on what had motivated his response. "I didn't plan to humiliate Marlon," he said, "but I couldn't let him attack my professionalism and integrity without defending them. And sometimes the best defense is simply telling the truth." But the full story of that evening reveals even more about the careful preparation and strategic thinking that Michael brought to what became one of the most famous confrontations in Hollywood history. In the days leading up to the AFI ceremony, Michael had heard rumors that Brando might use his platform to criticize the direction of modern Hollywood. Several people had warned Michael that he might become a target, given Brando's well-known disdain for commercial actors. "I'd been told by mutual friends that Marlon had been making comments about pretty boy actors and commercial hacks in private conversations," Michael revealed in a 1985 interview. "I didn't know if he would say something publicly, but I thought it was wise to be prepared." This preparation involved more than just mental readiness. Michael had quietly researched Brando's recent career, his professional reputation among directors and producers, and the specific incidents that had damaged his standing in the industry. "I've always believed that information is power," Michael explained. "If someone was going to attack my professionalism, I wanted to be able to respond with facts about their own professional record." The research revealed a pattern of behavior that contradicted everything Brando claimed to stand for: Despite his reputation as a serious artist, Brando's actual work habits were notoriously unprofessional. Directors spoke privately about his tardiness, his failure to learn lines, and his habit of disrupting productions with personal dramas and power struggles. Most damaging was the well-documented disaster of Mutiny on the Bounty, which had nearly bankrupted MGM due to Brando's interference and unprofessional behavior. The film had been intended as a prestige project that would showcase Brando's artistic range, but it became instead a cautionary tale about what happened when ego trumped professionalism. The Bounty situation was particularly relevant, Michael noted, because it showed how Marlon's claims about artistic integrity could actually mask deeply selfish and destructive behavior. Michael's decision to mention specific directors and incidents wasn't random. He had verified each story with multiple sources and had even spoken directly with some of the filmmakers involved. Francis Coppola confirmed the details about the Godfather set. Michael said he was frustrated by Marlon's behavior but had been too diplomatic to discuss it publicly. When I told him I might need to defend myself against Marlon's criticism, he gave me permission to share what he'd experienced. The preparation paid off in ways that Michael hadn't anticipated. When Brando began his attack, Michael was ready not just with specific counter-arguments, but with a deeper understanding of the psychological dynamics at play. I realized that Marlon's attack on me was really about his own insecurities, Michael explained. He was projecting his frustrations with his own career onto me because I represented the kind of consistent professionalism that he'd never achieved. This insight allowed Michael to respond not just factually but psychologically. Instead of simply defending himself, he was able to expose the deeper contradictions in Brando's position. The moment I mentioned the Superman payday, I could see that I'd hit the target, Michael recalled. Marlon knew that his decision to take $12 million for a comic book movie completely contradicted everything he'd just said about artistic integrity. The aftermath of the confrontation revealed just how carefully Michael had calibrated his response. He had exposed Brando's hypocrisy without destroying him personally, had defended his own reputation without appearing vindictive, and had done it all in a way that left Brando with the opportunity to apologize gracefully. I could have been much harsher, Michael admitted. There were other stories, other examples of unprofessional behavior that I didn't mention. But the goal wasn't to destroy Marlon, it was to make him acknowledge the truth about both of us. The industry's reaction to the confrontation was swift and decisive. Within days, Michael received calls from directors who had previously dismissed him as merely a commercial actor. Mike Nichols called me the next morning. Michael remembered. He said he'd always known I was a good actor, but watching me handle that situation with such intelligence and composure made him realize there were depths to my abilities that he hadn't fully appreciated. Similar calls came from other prestigious filmmakers who began to see Michael as someone who could handle complex, demanding roles that required both intelligence and emotional sophistication. The confrontation showed people that I wasn't just charming and professional, Michael reflected. It showed them that I could think strategically under pressure, that I had real backbone when it mattered. This perception led directly to some of Michael's finest work in the following years. Directors like John Huston and Sidney Lumet specifically sought him out for projects that required actors who could convey intelligence and inner strength. The AFI incident gave me access to a level of role that had previously been closed to me, Michael said. Suddenly I was being considered for parts that required psychological complexity and dramatic weight. The impact on Brando was equally dramatic but far more negative. The public exposure of his unprofessionalism and the humiliation of being forced to apologize on his knees damaged his reputation in ways that lasted for years. Marlon never fully recovered from that evening, observed director Arthur Penn, who had worked with both actors. The industry already knew about his problems, but Michael's response made it impossible to ignore them or make excuses for them. Studios became reluctant to hire Brando for major projects, knowing that his behavior could derail productions and create public relations disasters. His asking price dropped significantly, and the kinds of roles offered to him were increasingly limited to smaller, less prestigious projects. The Superman payday that Michael had criticized became even more significant in retrospect, noted entertainment journalist Rex Reed. It ended up being one of Marlon's last opportunities to earn serious money, because his reputation for difficulty made him virtually unemployable for big-budget productions. The psychological impact on Brando was perhaps even more significant than the professional consequences. Friends reported that he became increasingly reclusive, obsessed with the idea that he had been exposed as a fraud in front of his peers. Marlon never got over the humiliation, said actress Eva Marie Saint, who had worked with Brando in On the Waterfront. This led to a period of self-examination and attempted reform for Brando. He made efforts to be more professional on subsequent projects, arriving on time and learning his lines in advance, but the damage to his reputation was lasting, and the industry's perception of him had fundamentally changed. The AFI incident marked the end of Marlon's ability to get away with unprofessional behavior, observed critic Andrew Saris. Michael had called him out so publicly and so effectively that no one could pretend anymore that genius excused bad conduct. The confrontation also had broader implications for how the industry understood the relationship between artistic talent and professional behavior. For decades, studios and directors had tolerated difficult behavior from talented actors, assuming that creativity justified unprofessionalism. Michael's response to Marlon challenged that assumption, said producer Robert Evans. It showed that you could be both talented and professional, both artistic and reliable. The idea that you had to choose between creativity and professionalism was exposed as a false choice. This shift in thinking led to changes in how contracts were structured and how productions were managed. Studios began including specific professional conduct requirements in actor contracts, and directors became less tolerant of disruptive behavior from cast members. The Caine-Brando confrontation became a turning point, explained entertainment lawyer David Begelman. It marked the beginning of the end for the era when talented actors could hold productions hostage with their personal dramas and unprofessional conduct. 20 years later, when both men were asked about the incident for a retrospective documentary, their different perspectives revealed how lastingly the confrontation had affected their careers and their understanding of their craft. "I learned something important that night," Brando said in his interview. "I learned that talent without discipline is worthless, and that attacking someone else's professionalism when your own is questionable is not just hypocritical, it's self-destructive." Michael's reflection was characteristically more measured. "The evening taught me about the power of preparation and the importance of being able to defend your professional reputation with facts rather than emotions. But more than that, it taught me that sometimes the most effective response to cruelty is simply telling the truth with clarity and conviction." When Marlon Brando called Michael Caine a hack in front of 200 people, he thought he was exposing a fraud. Instead, Michael's response exposed the real fraud, a supposedly serious artist who had abandoned the discipline and professionalism that true artistry requires. The image of Brando on his knees, apologizing to the man he had tried to humiliate, became one of the defining moments in Hollywood history. It proved that sometimes the most devastating response to cruelty isn't anger or violence, but simply the truth delivered with calm precision by someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. The legacy of that confrontation continues to influence how actors, directors, and producers understand the relationship between talent and professionalism. Acting schools now teach the incident as an example of how preparation and strategic thinking can triumph over raw aggression and public intimidation. "The Caine-Brando confrontation is required viewing in our professional development classes," said Juilliard acting instructor Sarah Chen. "It demonstrates that true artistic strength comes from combining talent with discipline, preparation, and respect for your craft and colleagues." Today, when young actors face criticism or professional challenges, many remember Michael Caine's response to Marlon Brando's attack. It serves as a reminder that the most effective way to defend your reputation isn't through anger or retaliation, but through demonstrating the very qualities that your critics claim you lack: professionalism, intelligence, and unshakable integrity under pressure.